cry, my sister. We are here. Let your heart break, but know you are not alone.
The sweetest revenge stories from African folktales. They laughed at her tears, mocked her silence, celebrated her downfall like a festival. She was called weak, called cursed, called nothing. But what they didn't know, what African folktales always warn us about, is that the quiet ones are usually the most dangerous. Because in these stories, revenge doesn't come with shouting. It comes with patience, with wisdom, with time. A betrayed daughter who waited years before speaking. A humiliated widow who smiled while planning justice. A poor man everyone trampled until the day power bowed to him. These are not loud revenge stories. They are sweet ones. The kind where karma walks slowly, but never misses its destination. Tonight, you will hear stories where evil thought it had won, only to realize it was standing at the edge of its own punishment. These are the sweetest revenge stories from African folktales. And by the end, you'll understand why our ancestors said, "Do not mock the silent drum. It may be saving its loudest beat for you." The sound arrived before the pain did. Laughter sharp enough to cut skin, loud enough to drown dignity, rolling through the open courtyard like it had permission to stay. It wasn't one voice. It was many, overlapping, feeding off one another, growing bolder with every second she remained standing there. Dust clung to her bare feet. Heat pressed against her scalp. Eyes followed her every movement, not with concern, but with hunger. This was entertainment now. A moment stretched too long. A silence waiting to be filled by cruelty. Someone clapped. Someone leaned closer. Someone whispered her name like it was a joke. The ground felt unsteady. Not because it moved, but because everything she thought was solid had cracked at once. This was supposed to be ordinary. Just another day. But humiliation has a way of announcing itself, without warning. And as the laughter grew louder, something inside her folded inward, not broken, not destroyed, but changed. Because no one there understood what that sound was really doing, or what it had just awakened. The crowd shifted, bodies angling for a better view, as if this moment would be retold later, polished and exaggerated over meals and evening fires. Faces she recognized stared without blinking, neighbors, relatives, people who had once shared food with her. Their expressions carried relief, even joy, the kind that comes when misfortune lands on someone else. A finger pointed. A head shook slowly, theatrically. The laughter didn't stop because no one stopped it. Shame settled on her shoulders like wet cloth, heavy and suffocating, sticking to every breath she tried to take. She felt smaller with each second, not because she was shrinking, but because the space around her was swallowing everything else. She wanted the moment to end, but it refused. And somewhere between the sound of mocking voices and the heat burning her skin, a realization surfaced. Quiet, unwelcome, unavoidable. This wasn't about one mistake. This wasn't about truth. This was about power. And power, once tasted by a crowd, never lets go easily, unless something stronger takes it back. A breeze passed through, stirring dust and fabric, but it brought no relief. Only the smell of earth and sweat and judgment. Someone laughed again, louder than before, as if testing how far cruelty could go without consequence. She lowered her eyes, not in surrender, but because meeting their gaze felt like handing them something they didn't deserve. Her chest tightened, each breath shallow, controlled, measured. She learned quickly that crying would only fuel them. Begging would only entertain them. This crowd wasn't interested in explanation. They wanted collapse. And as she stood there absorbing it all, something subtle happened. Something no one noticed because it made no noise. The pain stopped spreading. It settled. It focused. It became sharp instead of overwhelming. In African folktales, this is the moment elders warn about. The instant humiliation stops being damage and starts becoming instruction. Because pain that concentrates doesn't disappear. It plans. And while the crowd laughed, something else was forming beneath her silence, something patient enough to wait. The laughter began to thin, not because mercy arrived, but because boredom did. Cruelty, after all, is impatient. People glanced away, already reaching for the next distraction, the next story, the next target. She felt it, the shift from spectacle to afterthought. But the damage had already been done. Words had landed. Images had burned themselves into memory. The moment was now permanent. Someone brushed past her shoulder, without apology. Another shook their head one last time, sealing their judgment as if it were final. Yet even as the crowd dissolved, the weight of what happened remained, pressing deeper with every step she took away. Each footfall felt louder than it should have. Each breath felt borrowed. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't afford to realize, was that moments like this don't fade. They root themselves. They grow quietly. And long after laughter ends, its echo stays behind, waiting for the day it will be answered, not with noise, but with consequence. The path home stretched longer than usual, winding through familiar spaces that suddenly felt hostile. Walls she had passed 1,000 times now seemed to watch her. Even the ground felt different beneath her feet, as if it remembered what had happened and refused to forget. She replayed the moment without trying to, every laugh looping in her head, every face frozen in memory. But something strange accompanied the replay, not just pain, but clarity. The kind that comes when illusions fall away. She saw who enjoyed her humiliation. She saw who stayed silent. She saw who looked away too late. And with that clarity came a quiet shift in how she understood the world. This wasn't random cruelty. This was structure. Hierarchy. A system that fed on weakness and rewarded loudness. And systems, she realized, only survive until someone learns how they work. The laughter had opened a wound, yes, but wounds, when they stop bleeding, leave behind something stronger than skin. Night arrived without ceremony, wrapping the village in shadow, cooling the air but not the memory. Somewhere, people were still talking about her. She knew that without hearing it. Stories had already started changing shape, exaggerating, shrinking, twisting. By morning, she would be something else entirely in their mouths. A lesson, a warning, a joke. She sat alone, listening to the quiet, feeling the contrast between the noise earlier and the stillness now. And in that stillness, her thoughts sharpened further. She didn't imagine confrontation. She didn't imagine revenge, not yet. What she imagined was endurance.
Time.
Distance. She imagined becoming invisible enough to be underestimated. Because nothing disarms arrogance faster than the belief that it has already won. And as the night deepened, one truth settled firmly in her chest. The laughter thought it ended something today. In reality, it had only begun. Dawn would come. Life would continue. People would forget the details even if they remembered the feeling. But she wouldn't forget any of it. Not the sound, not the heat, not the way the crowd leaned in instead of stepping back. This moment would travel with her, not as a burden, but as a compass. African folktales often begin this way, with humiliation mistaken for defeat, with silence mistaken for emptiness. The laughter believed it had power because it was loud. It never considered what grows in quiet soil. And as she finally closed her eyes, exhaustion heavy but resolve heavier, the unanswered question lingered. One the crowd never thought to ask. What happens when the person you broke learns how to wait? Morning arrived with the scrape of metal and the murmur of life restarting, and she moved through it like a shadow, learning new rules. Sounds felt sharper now. The clink of bowls, the rustle of cloth, the thud of footsteps on packed earth, each one reminding her how visible noise could be. She chose quiet instead. Not the empty quiet of defeat, but the deliberate quiet of restraint. Her eyes stayed lowered longer than necessary. Her shoulders relaxed when they wanted to tense. She answered questions with nods that gave nothing away. Silence wrapped around her like a second skin, cooling the heat left behind by yesterday's laughter. People noticed the change, but misunderstood it. They mistook her calm for collapse, her restraint for surrender. And that misunderstanding gave her space.
Space to breathe.
Space to observe. Space to learn who watched her too closely and who stopped watching at all. In folktales, silence is never absence, it's alignment. And as she aligned herself with patience, the world around her leaned into a false sense of victory, never realizing it had just handed her the advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. If stories like this remind you that cruelty doesn't win forever, subscribe. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. The days settled into a rhythm that hid its own tension. She swept, carried, walked, paused, small motions repeated until they looked like routine. But inside that routine, her senses sharpened. She noticed how conversations stopped when she approached and restarted when she passed. She noticed how eyes lingered, measuring, reassured by her quiet. She noticed which names were spoken with sympathy and which with contempt. Silence gave her access to truths noise never reveals. It allowed her to hear the shape of the village's thinking, the angles of its cruelty, the shortcuts it took to feel righteous. She stored these observations carefully, not like grudges, but like tools. Every smirk, every half-truth, every careless assumption added weight to something forming just out of sight. People spoke freely around her now, convinced she no longer mattered. And nothing fuels overconfidence like being believed. The quiet widened the gap between what they assumed and what she knew, and that gap was becoming dangerous. Heat pressed down again by midday, drawing people into shade and conversation, and she slipped through it unnoticed. Her silence softened faces that had once hardened against her. It reassured them. She was no longer a problem, no longer a story, just another figure moving through the day. But the absence of response did something unexpected. It unsettled the loudest among them. They waited for reaction that never came. They leaned closer, searching for cracks, for tears, for proof of damage. Finding none, they filled the space themselves, talking more, laughing louder, oversharing. Silence became a mirror they couldn't stop looking into. And in that mirror, their impatience began to show. In African folktales, patience often outlasts power because it forces mistakes. The louder side always slips first. She watched those slips closely, marking the moments arrogance spoke too soon, revealed too much, crossed lines it assumed were invisible. Each mistake tightened the quiet coil inside her. Evenings stretched longer now, shadows deepening as fires sparked and stories traded hands. She stayed on the edges, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unseen. The smell of smoke clung to the air, mixing with laughter that felt careless, unearned. Her silence unsettled fewer people now. They had grown comfortable with it. Comfort breeds neglect. Neglect breeds opportunity. She learned who feared elders' warnings and who mocked them. She learned whose dreams were restless and whose arrogance slept easily. And with each piece of knowledge came a small, steady calm. Not relief, not joy, control. Silence allowed her to step out of the immediate pain and into the long view, where time stretches and outcomes shift. She wasn't planning revenge yet, not in form, not in action. She was planning endurance. And endurance, once mastered, becomes leverage. Rain arrived without warning one afternoon, sudden and heavy, scattering people into doorways and shelters. She stood still for a moment, letting the drops soak into her hair and clothes, washing dust from her skin. Silence has weight in moments like this, when the world narrows to breath and sound and sensation. The rain muffled everything, turning voices into distant echoes. In that hush, she felt the strength of choosing not to speak. Words would have been easy. Accusations would have been tempting, but easy things rarely last. Silence endured. It settled into her bones, slowing her reactions, sharpening her thinking. She understood now that restraint wasn't about swallowing pain, it was about directing it. And as the rain eased and people emerged again, laughing at the weather, she stepped back into motion, carrying with her a calm they didn't recognize as dangerous. Weeks passed, and her silence became expected, even boring. The village moved on, convinced the moment had broken her. But time does strange things to stories left unattended. Without reaction to feed on, their version of her began to thin, lose color, fall apart. Meanwhile, her internal world grew dense with intention. She practiced remembering without reacting, observing without revealing. Silence taught her timing, when to be present, when to disappear. It taught her that waiting isn't passive, it's active restraint. And restraint, once learned, changes the balance of any room. People started to underestimate her openly now, speaking around her as if she were furniture. That underestimation settled like a blessing she didn't acknowledge. Because the quieter she became, the louder their assumptions grew, and assumptions are the most reliable blindfold arrogance ever wears. Night returned, cool and heavy with insects and distant movement, and she lay awake listening to it all. Silence surrounded her, not empty but full, humming with possibility. She felt the shift happening slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way pressure builds beneath still water. In folktales, this is the moment before paths diverge, before the world decides who will carry weight and who will lose it. Her silence had stopped being a response. It had become a position, a place she could move from when the time was right. And as sleep finally pulled her under, one question remained suspended in the quiet, unanswered and unresolved. How long would the village mistake her patience for weakness, before silence answered them in a language they could no longer ignore? Voices began traveling faster than footsteps, slipping through doorways and over fences before the sun had fully climbed. By the time morning heat settled in, the story had already grown legs. It moved from mouth to mouth, gathering confidence with each retelling, smoothing over uncertainty until it sounded like fact. She felt it in the way people paused when she passed, in the way greetings thinned and eyes avoided hers too deliberately. Judgment had been made somewhere she wasn't invited to speak. The village had chosen a version of events because it was easier than sitting with doubt. And doubt, once avoided, hardens quickly into certainty. She walked through it all without interruption, her silence making room for assumptions to bloom unchecked. What they didn't realize was that every rumor sharpened the edges of what was coming. Because stories told too early have a habit of collapsing later, when truth finally arrives and asks who spoke first. Midday brought gatherings, under trees, near doorways, around shared tasks, where opinions were traded like currency. Heads nodded in agreement before questions could surface. Sympathy was rationed, and blame handed out freely. She became a symbol, not a person. A cautionary tale stripped of context, used to reinforce unspoken rules about place and power. Her absence from these conversations only emboldened them. Silence was read as admission, stillness as guilt. But beneath the surface of every confident claim ran a thin thread of insecurity. People spoke louder than necessary, repeated themselves, leaned into certainty because certainty felt safer than reflection. In African folktales, villages that rush to judgment often seal their own embarrassment. And as the story hardened into shared belief, it also became fragile, dependent on never being questioned. She noticed how quickly kindness shifted into performance. Smiles offered too late. Help offered only when watched. A hand extended not to lift, but to appear generous. The village wasn't cruel in obvious ways. It was efficient in quiet ones. Exclusion disguised as normalcy. Distance framed as propriety. And yet, through it all, she remained present, visible enough to be discussed, distant enough to be misunderstood. Her calm unnerved a few, irritated others. Why wasn't she defending herself? Why wasn't she angry? They expected collapse. They got composure. That mismatch unsettled the most vocal among them. Because when a narrative requires a victim to play along, refusal becomes a threat. And her refusal, wordless, steady, was beginning to stretch the story thin. Afternoons stretched long and heavy, the air thick with heat and assumption. Children repeated what they overheard, turning adult judgment into careless echoes. Elders listened without intervening, choosing harmony over inquiry. Silence from authority made the rumors feel sanctioned. The village had completed its shift from observer to participant, and participation carries consequence. She watched it all unfold from the margins, learning not just who believed the story, but who benefited from it. Some gained relief that it wasn't them. Others gained status by aligning with the loudest voices. A few gained power by steering the narrative. Every motive revealed itself eventually. And as motive surfaced, so did patterns. Patterns she committed to memory, knowing they would matter later. Evenings brought a false sense of closure. Fires burned. Laughter returned. The story became background noise, something settled and agreed upon. People relaxed into their conclusion, confident they had seen the truth clearly. But certainty has weight, and weight slows reaction. They didn't notice the subtle shifts, the way some conversations stopped mid-sentence when she appeared, the way others lowered their voices instinctively. Doubt crept in quietly, unwelcome but persistent. Not doubt about her innocence, but doubt about their own certainty. And doubt, once introduced, never leaves the same way it enters. It lingers. It asks questions when no one is ready to answer them. Days passed, and the village's confidence began to show cracks, not in public, but in private. Side glances. Half-statements. Revisions whispered too softly to count as retractions. The story required constant maintenance now, constant agreement, constant reinforcement. Without her reaction to anchor it, the narrative floated, unstable. She noticed who stopped repeating it and who doubled down. Who grew quieter. Who grew sharper. Silence had done something unexpected. It had shifted the burden of proof. They now had to convince themselves. And self-conviction is exhausting work. In folktales, this is the turning point where judgment begins to rot from the inside. Night settled again, bringing cool air and unresolved thoughts. She lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of life continuing without her permission. The village believed it had chosen wisely, that it had closed the matter. But choices made too quickly age badly. Stories told without patience lose their strength when tested by time. And as sleep hovered just out of reach, one quiet truth pressed forward, steady and undeniable. The village had taken sides before the story was finished. And when the ending finally arrived, it would not be gentle with those who spoke too soon. The house felt smaller the day the truth settled in, walls leaning closer, as if they had secrets of their own. Morning light crept through narrow openings, landing on familiar objects that suddenly looked foreign. She moved carefully, sensing the shift before she understood it. Poverty had taught her to endure hunger, to ration hope, to survive on less. Betrayal taught her something colder. It arrived without warning, carried on ordinary gestures, shared meals, casual glances, routines that pretended nothing had changed. The realization wasn't loud. It was precise. The people she trusted most had already chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. This wasn't about scarcity. This was about allegiance. And allegiance, once broken, cuts deeper than any lack of food or money ever could. She noticed it in the way help was offered with conditions attached, in the way advice sounded rehearsed, angled towards someone else's benefit. Familiar hands withheld what they once gave freely. Words that used to comfort now redirected blame. Family, she learned, can sharpen cruelty by wrapping it in concern. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They smiled. And those smiles landed heavier than insults. She felt the betrayal settle into her chest, solid and unmoving. Hunger could be eased. Hardship could be worked through. But this rearranged her understanding of loyalty entirely. It taught her that blood ties don't guarantee protection. Sometimes they guarantee access. And access, when abused, leaves the deepest mark. Afternoons grew tense, thick with unspoken expectations. She was urged to apologize for things she didn't do, to accept blame for peace's sake. Compromise was framed as maturity. Silence was demanded, not chosen. She felt the weight of obligation pressing in from all sides, each request framed as necessity. Family gatherings became negotiations she never agreed to enter. Each interaction revealed a new layer of alignment, she hadn't anticipated. They weren't neutral. They were invested. And their investment required her submission. The betrayal wasn't sudden anymore. It was structural, built into decisions made without her, futures planned around her absence. She stood at the center of it, watching trust drain from familiar faces, replaced by calculation. Evenings brought forced closeness, shared spaces heavy with tension that refused to name itself. She listened more than she spoke, watching how quickly sympathy turned into strategy. The language of care was used to guide her toward outcomes that benefited everyone else. She realized then that betrayal often disguises itself as help. It asks for compliance instead of consent. It praises sacrifice while demanding more. And as she absorbed each moment, something inside her recalibrated. She stopped expecting fairness from those who had already proven their priorities. She stopped hoping they would remember who she was before the story spread. That hope, once released, made room for something steadier. Days passed, and the emotional distance widened. She felt it when decisions were announced instead of discussed, when her presence was acknowledged, but her voice wasn't. Family bonds thinned into formalities. She wasn't cast out. She was sidelined. And sidelining is often more effective than rejection. It keeps you close enough to control, far enough to silence. She learned quickly that poverty had never been her greatest vulnerability. Trust had been. And now that trust was gone, replaced by clarity, clarity stripped relationships down to their core motivations. Who benefited? Who feared loss? Who mistook power for righteousness? Each realization hardened her resolve without making her bitter. She began to understand the quiet cruelty of betrayal, how it reframes your reality until you doubt your own memory, how it uses familiarity to lower your guard, how it convinces others they're doing the right thing while doing the most damage. But awareness has weight. Once gained, it changes posture, tone, timing. She adjusted without announcement. She gave less, expected less, revealed nothing. The betrayal that once threatened to hollow her out instead carved space for independence, for patience, for strategy. In folktales, this is where endurance separates from survival. Survival reacts. Endurance adapts. Night fell again, heavy and still, carrying the unspoken aftermath of fractured trust. She lay awake, replaying moments not to suffer, but to study. Betrayal had taught her the true cost of misplaced loyalty and the value of restraint. Family had revealed itself, not as refuge but as terrain. And terrain, once mapped, can be navigated. As sleep finally edged closer, one unresolved question hovered in the darkness, waiting for its time. What happens when those who betrayed you realize they taught you exactly how to outgrow them? The news arrived like weather turning without warning, heavy and final, flattening everything in its path. One moment there was routine, the scrape of a chair, the scent of cooking smoke, the rhythm of ordinary breath. And the next, there was absence so loud it swallowed sound. Grief didn't ask permission. It rearranged the room, the future, the shape of her name. She felt it first in her hands, trembling as if they no longer recognized their purpose, then in her chest, where each inhale felt borrowed. The village gathered quickly, offering condolences that landed softly, but couldn't stay. Sympathy has a short attention span. What lingered was the weight of what she had lost: security, partnership, identity. Gone in a single, irreversible moment. And as the day dragged on, she realized grief would not destroy her loudly. It would test her quietly, hour by hour, asking how much she could hold without breaking. Mornings after loss carry a different temperature, cooler in places that should feel warm. She woke early, the space beside her untouched, the air still heavy with memory. People spoke gently around her now, voices lowered, eyes careful, as if grief made her fragile glass. She accepted their caution with a nod, knowing it would fade. Pity always does. What surprised her was how quickly responsibility followed sympathy, expectations wrapped in concern, advice disguised as care. She was urged to move on, to adjust, to be reasonable. But grief doesn't respond to instruction. It responds to time. And time, she decided, would be hers to control. She didn't reject help. She filtered it. She learned which gestures came with strings attached and which were simply human. That discernment, born from loss, sharpened her instincts in ways comfort never had. Days folded into weeks, and the village resumed its pace, leaving her to navigate the silence left behind. She discovered that grief creates space, painful, empty space, but space nonetheless. And in that space, she began to practice something new: composure. Not the forced kind, not the performative strength people admire, but a quieter discipline that held emotion without spilling it everywhere. She learned to smile when expected, to listen without absorbing, to move through gatherings without surrendering herself to them. That smile wasn't joy. It was control. It unsettled people who wanted visible weakness, who needed her pain to reassure their own order. In folktales, widows who survive do so by mastering the balance between presence and distance. She was learning that balance now, one measured step at a time. Afternoons brought work that demanded focus, grounding her in physical motion when thoughts threatened to spiral. She cleaned, sorted, planned, tasks that kept grief from swelling unchecked. In the repetition, she found rhythm. In rhythm, restraint. She noticed how people watched her from the corners of their eyes, confused by her steadiness. They expected collapse. They got consistency. That confusion bred underestimation, and underestimation opened doors. She wasn't scheming yet. She was stabilizing. Grief, when disciplined, becomes insight. It teaches which attachments are necessary and which are habits. She began to let go of expectations she could no longer afford, trimming her emotional life down to what mattered most. The smile stayed, calm and unreadable, while her interior world grew firm and intentional. Evenings tested her resolve, when quiet stretched too far and memory pressed in. She let it come, but on her terms. She cried without witnesses, mourned without explanation, honored loss without turning it into spectacle. That privacy gave her power. In a world eager to narrate her pain, she reclaimed authorship. She understood then that grief doesn't only take, it clarifies. It strips away illusions, revealing who stands steady and who circles for advantage. Each realization was painful, but each was also freeing. She wasn't hardened, she was refined. And refinement, like patience, changes the way others move around you. Weeks later, when practical matters surfaced, property, obligations, futures, she met them with the same composed smile. People underestimated that smile, mistaking it for acceptance. They mistook her calm for compliance. But beneath it was a sharpened sense of timing. She listened more than she spoke. She asked fewer questions and answered even fewer. Grief had taught her the cost of reacting too quickly. It had also taught her the value of waiting until the moment mattered. In folktales, the widow who endures does not rush justice. She prepares for it. And preparation, she knew, looks like nothing from the outside. Night settled again, gentle and cool, carrying the quiet assurance of survival. She lay awake not in despair, but in assessment, measuring what she had learned against what lay ahead. Grief had disciplined her emotions, narrowed her focus, strengthened her resolve. The smile she wore had become armor, light enough to carry, strong enough to protect. And as sleep finally took hold, one truth remained, steady and unresolved. Those who believed grief had softened her were about to learn how loss, when mastered, becomes the most patient force of all. The first warning came quietly, almost politely, the way danger often does when it expects to be dismissed. An elder paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing as if something unseen had crossed his path. A proverb was offered instead of advice, its meaning left unfinished. The air felt different afterward, thicker, unsettled, but no one pressed the moment. Warnings are inconvenient things. They interrupt confidence. Those who felt powerful brushed it aside with laughter and certainty, convinced that nothing could touch them now. She noticed, though. She always noticed. the way arrogance rushed forward while wisdom stayed behind. In African folktales, this is the moment fate leans closer, listening to see who will pay attention. And when no one did, something shifted quietly out of alignment. Days later, dreams began circulating, spoken of casually, half mocked, half feared. Someone claimed they saw water rising where it shouldn't. Someone else mentioned footsteps following them without sound. These stories were treated like entertainment, passed around with nervous smiles. The powerful scoffed. Fear, they believed, was for the weak. They mistook warning for superstition, caution for cowardice. Lines were crossed without hesitation, boundaries ignored, respect withheld, traditions bent to convenience. Each small act of dismissal stacked upon the last, building momentum towards something no one wanted to name. She watched from a distance, calm and observant, understanding that arrogance accelerates its own downfall by refusing to slow down. The environment itself seemed to respond. Heat lingered longer than usual. Nights grew restless, filled with unfamiliar sounds. Animals moved differently, uneasy. Elders spoke less, retreating into watchful silence. The signs were everywhere for those trained to see them. But confidence blinds more effectively than darkness. The powerful continued as before, louder now, emboldened by the absence of immediate consequence. They mistook delay for permission. In folktales, delay is never mercy, it is preparation. And every ignored signal narrowed the path ahead, guiding events toward a single, unavoidable outcome. She felt the change too, not as fear, but as confirmation. The warnings weren't meant for her. They were meant for those who believed themselves untouchable. She moved carefully, choosing when to be present and when to vanish, aware that lines were being crossed at a pace that would soon demand correction. She didn't interfere. She didn't intervene. Wisdom rarely does. Instead, she let patterns complete themselves. Arrogance has a rhythm, predictable, escalating, self-assured. It always believes the next step will be just like the last. And that belief, once entrenched, becomes its weakness. Confrontations began to surface, sharp and unnecessary, driven by impatience rather than need. Authority was asserted where none was required. Cruelty was justified as discipline. Each action pushed further beyond what tradition allowed, beyond what balance could tolerate. Those who benefited felt untouchable, convinced that history favored them. They spoke openly now, dismissing elders, mocking restraint, rewriting norms to suit their comfort. But norms, once broken too often, don't disappear, they respond. And response, when delayed, gathers force. She noticed how quickly fear shifted from external to internal, how the loudest voices grew restless at night, how certainty fractured into irritation. Warnings ignored don't vanish, they wait. They echo back later in unfamiliar ways, through accidents, reversals, moments that don't make sense until it's too late. The powerful sensed something slipping, though they couldn't name it. Their confidence grew sharper, more aggressive, as if volume could silence unease. That desperation marked the crossing of the final line. In folktales, this is where the balance tips, unnoticed by those standing on it. Night fell heavy and watchful, carrying with it the accumulated weight of every ignored sign. She lay awake, not anxious, but alert, aware that the world had shifted from warning to consequence. Lines had been crossed too many times, and tradition had a long memory. The reckoning would not arrive with drama or announcement. It would arrive the way it always does, quietly, precisely, and without apology. And as sleep edged closer, one question hovered unresolved in the darkness. When the first consequence lands, who will understand it in time, and who will already be too far gone to step back? Time began to stretch in subtle ways, pulling days into weeks and weeks into years without announcing the change. The village settled into routine again, convinced the worst had passed, convinced nothing important was happening anymore. Seasons turned with familiar sounds, rain tapping roofs, dry wind lifting dust, leaves browning and returning. And life moved forward as if balance had already been restored. But stillness can be deceptive. What looked like nothing was actually accumulation. She moved quietly through this waiting season, not counting days, not marking milestones, simply allowing time to do what it does best when left undisturbed. The absence of drama lulled everyone else into comfort. No one watches closely when nothing seems to be happening. And that neglect created the space where change could grow undetected. Mornings became predictable, and predictability softened attention. People stopped measuring their words around her, stopped checking their actions, stopped imagining consequences. Power settled into habit, and habit dulls awareness. She noticed how routines exposed vulnerabilities, who relied on what, who overlooked whom, who assumed permanence where none existed. Time gave her distance from the pain that once burned sharply, replacing it with something steadier. Memory didn't fade. It clarified. The waiting season wasn't empty. It was instructional. Each passing day refined her understanding of timing, restraint, and patience. In African folktales, waiting is never passive. It is movement without noise, growth without display. And while others mistook quiet for stagnation, she learned how to let patience do the heavy work. Years carry a way of reshaping people, smoothing some edges while sharpening others. Children grew taller. Elders slowed. Circumstances shifted just enough to go unnoticed. She adapted with them, adjusting her pace to match the world's, blending into the background so completely she became predictable. Predictability, she understood, was protection. It lowered defenses. It made her invisible at the exact moments when visibility would have raised suspicion. The village no longer told stories about her. She had slipped from memory into assumption. That disappearance was the waiting season's greatest gift. Because nothing alarms power more than relevance, but irrelevance feels safe. Afternoons passed in long, quiet stretches where light moved slowly across walls and floors. She used those hours to observe patterns repeating themselves without correction. The same mistakes resurfaced, the same shortcuts taken, the same arrogance rewarded. Time revealed how little people change when unchallenged. She watched confidence calcify into carelessness. And carelessness, when paired with authority, creates openings. In folktales, patience does not rush to expose weakness. It waits for weakness to expose itself. She recognized that moment approaching, not in sudden signs, but in the way discipline loosened, in the way rules bent without resistance. Evenings brought reflection rather than regret. She measured how far she had come from the woman who once stood trembling beneath laughter. The waiting season had rebuilt her from the inside out. Emotional reactions had slowed. Decisions carried more weight. Silence no longer felt like defense, it felt like choice. She had learned to trust time not as an enemy, but as an ally that outlasts emotion. Others mistook her endurance for acceptance. They believed she had adapted to her place. That belief settled deeply into their behavior, shaping decisions that would later trap them. Comfort makes people careless. Carelessness writes its own ending. Opportunities surfaced quietly, unannounced, and easily missed by those not watching. Small shifts in responsibility, minor changes in access, subtle rearrangements in influence. She stepped into them without resistance, without celebration, allowing them to feel natural, inevitable. Time rewards those who move with it, not against it. Each step forward seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a path no one else noticed. Power rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates slowly, disguising itself as coincidence. And by the time it's recognized, it's already rooted. Night settled again, familiar and calm, carrying with it the quiet certainty of preparation nearing completion. She lay awake, aware that the waiting season was thinning, that time was no longer stretching, it was narrowing. In folktales, this is the moment just before reversal, when patience finishes its work and steps aside. The village slept comfortably, confident in the stability of its order. But beneath that comfort, momentum had shifted. And as sleep finally claimed her, one unspoken truth pressed forward, steady and unavoidable. The longest waiting seasons often end without warning, and when they do, everything changes at once. The day began like any other, ordinary enough to lower every guard in the village. Morning light spilled softly across rooftops, warming walls that had heard too many secrets to react anymore. People moved through routines without urgency, confident in the stability of their lives. Nothing announced itself. No omen cut through the air. And that was the danger. Change rarely arrives dressed as spectacle. She woke with the same calm she had practiced for years, feeling a quiet certainty settle into her chest. Something had aligned overnight, not emotionally, but structurally. Pieces long separated by time and patience had finally met. The world hadn't shifted loudly. It had simply tilted, and only those standing on the edge could feel it. Movement carried a different weight that morning. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Small delays rippled through familiar patterns. A decision made elsewhere altered paths without explanation. People sensed disruption but couldn't name its source. She noticed immediately. The rhythm of power had changed, subtle but undeniable. Doors that once felt closed now opened without resistance. Requests that once required permission arrived as assumptions. Nothing was declared. Nothing celebrated. The absence of ceremony made it unsettling. In African folktales, reversals are rarely announced because justice does not need permission to arrive. It moves when balance demands it, not when people are ready. By midday, discomfort had spread among those who once moved with confidence. Authority hesitated. Certainty faltered. They spoke carefully now, testing words before releasing them, as if the air itself might respond. She moved through it all with the same steady pace, neither rushing nor retreating. Her presence carried a new gravity, unspoken but felt. People adjusted around her without understanding why. Power does not always reveal itself through control. Sometimes it reveals itself through the way others begin to adapt without being told to. Afternoon light sharpened shadows, and with it came realization. Small truths surfaced, long delayed by convenience and silence. Documents resurfaced. Promises once ignored regained relevance. Decisions made in haste years ago returned with consequences attached. Nothing exploded. Everything tightened. Those who benefited from the old order felt it slipping, not suddenly, but decisively. The ground beneath them hadn't cracked, it had shifted. And there is no footing more dangerous than ground that moves quietly. She felt no triumph, no rush of victory. Satisfaction would have been premature. This was not the end. It was the crossing, the moment where effort handed control to inevitability. She remained composed, allowing events to unfold without interference. In folktales, the sweetest reversals are those that feel natural, as if the world is merely correcting itself. The oppressors searched for causes. They blamed chance, timing, misunderstanding. They never looked at her, and that oversight sealed what was already done. By evening, the village buzzed with low tension, conversations hushed and speculative. The shift could no longer be ignored, but it still lacked a name. Fear crept in not through threat, but through uncertainty. Those who once spoke loudly now listened more than they talked. Those who once dismissed warnings remembered them too late. She watched calmly, aware that this moment had been years in the making. Karma does not rush. It arrives prepared. Night settled without announcement, carrying a stillness heavier than noise. The reversal had completed itself quietly, leaving everyone to discover its meaning in their own time. She lay awake, breathing evenly, knowing that the balance had shifted beyond negotiation. What came next would not be kind to arrogance. And as the village drifted into uneasy sleep, one question lingered unanswered, heavy and unavoidable. When people finally realize fortune has changed hands, will they understand why? Or will they only feel the loss? Fear entered the village quietly, without announcement, slipping into conversations and settling behind familiar faces. It showed itself in pauses that lasted too long, in laughter that stopped halfway through, in eyes that no longer held steady. Those who once moved freely now measured their steps, glancing around as if the ground itself might betray them. Confidence thinned into caution. Authority hesitated. She noticed it immediately. The change in posture, the way shoulders tightened when her shadow crossed a doorway. Power had not vanished, but it had lost its voice. And when power can no longer speak boldly, it begins to shake. By midday, certainty had fully fractured. Decisions were delayed. Instructions were repeated, softened, questioned. The same people who once dismissed warnings now searched for reassurance in each other's faces. Their dominance had depended on belief. Belief in permanence, belief in control. That belief was cracking. They whispered now, their voices low and careful, afraid of being overheard by forces they could no longer see. She moved among them unchanged, her calm amplifying their unease. Fear, when unspoken, grows louder inside the mind. Authority figures avoided confrontation, choosing absence over assertion. Meetings ended early. Plans stalled. No one wanted to be responsible for the next move. The powerful had begun to understand something too late. Power without legitimacy is fragile. It survives only as long as no one challenges it. And now, without a single shout or accusation, challenge surrounded them. She did not confront. She did not accuse. She simply existed, steady, unmoved, present. That presence reminded them of every moment they had dismissed, every warning ignored. Memory became their enemy. Afternoon light revealed the tremble more clearly. Hands shook while pouring drinks. Voices cracked during casual remarks. Eyes darted toward elders they had once mocked. The certainty that once insulated them from consequence was gone. They had believed silence meant submission. Now they wondered what else they had misunderstood. In African folktales, fear marks the point of no return, the moment when arrogance recognizes itself too late. And recognition, once it arrives, cannot be undone. She observed without satisfaction, understanding that fear is not justice, it is the doorway to it. People approached her cautiously now, offering politeness that felt rehearsed, respect that came too late. She accepted none of it and rejected none of it. Her neutrality unsettled them more than anger ever could. Because anger offers negotiation. Silence offers nothing. The powerful searched for leverage and found none. Their advantage had dissolved quietly, leaving only uncertainty behind. Evenings brought restless movement, sleeplessness spreading like a slow illness. Those who once slept easily now lay awake, replaying decisions they could not revise. Fear rearranged their priorities, turning small risks into unbearable threats. They had crossed lines believing consequence was distant, abstract. Now consequence felt close, intimate, unavoidable. She remained distant yet visible, a reminder that endurance outlasts dominance. And endurance, once proven, becomes authority. Night closed in heavy and tense, pressing unease into every corner of the village. The powerful understood now that the ground beneath them had shifted beyond recovery. Fear had replaced certainty, and with it came the knowledge that justice no longer needed to announce itself. As sleep refused to come, one question haunted them relentlessly, unanswered and unforgiving. When power begins to tremble, how long before it finally falls? The reckoning arrived without raised voices, without confrontation, without the chaos everyone had braced for. Morning unfolded calmly, almost gently, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Yet beneath that calm, decisions were being finalized, doors closing softly where they once stood open. Justice moved through familiar spaces like a quiet current, reshaping outcomes without asking permission. She felt it not as excitement, but as relief. The kind that comes when effort hands control back to balance. There was no urge to announce victory. Justice didn't need witnesses to validate it. It needed only accuracy. People noticed the results before they understood the process. Positions shifted. Privileges evaporated. Responsibilities landed where they had long been avoided. The powerful searched for explanations and found only paperwork, procedure, and consequences that could not be argued away. Nothing could be shouted down. Nothing could be overturned with influence. This was not revenge fueled by anger. It was correction enforced by truth. She remained still within it all, neither celebrating nor retreating, allowing outcomes to speak on her behalf. Silence, once dismissed, now carried authority. Afternoons grew heavy with realization. Those who once laughed now understood the cost of certainty without humility. They recognized too late that justice had been assembling quietly, piece by piece, while they were distracted by comfort. Their voices, once sharp, softened into careful tones. Apologies surfaced, but apology, when delayed, sounds different. It carries regret instead of repair. She listened without absorbing, knowing that justice is not obligated to soothe those it corrects. It exists to restore balance, not comfort pride. The village adjusted reluctantly, reshaping routines around a new reality. No announcement marked the change, yet everyone felt it. Influence had shifted to those who endured, not those who dominated. The absence of spectacle frustrated some, disappointed others. They wanted drama, confrontation, noise. But the quiet unsettled them more. It forced reflection. It left no distraction to hide behind. In African folktales, this is the most cutting form of justice. The kind that leaves people alone with their understanding. She walked through familiar paths differently now, not because the world bowed, but because it recalibrated. Respect arrived naturally, stripped of performance. Fear faded into distance. What remained was acknowledgement. Justice, when complete, changes posture more than language. People stood straighter, spoke carefully, measured themselves before acting.
She did not need to demand this shift.
It followed her like shadow follows light. Evenings carried a new tone, quieter but steadier. Stories were told differently now, lessons drawn without pointing fingers. Elders nodded knowingly. Younger ones listened longer. The memory of what happened settled into collective awareness, reshaping behavior without instruction. Justice had done its work. It had taught without humiliating, corrected without cruelty. That restraint gave it permanence. Night arrived calm and resolved, closing a chapter without spectacle. She lay awake briefly, feeling the weight lift, not completely, but enough. The laughter that once opened the wound had been answered, not with noise, but with outcome. And as sleep finally took her, one truth stood clear and finished. The sweetest justice never raises its voice, because it doesn't need to. The story widened quietly, pulling back from individuals and moments to reveal something older, deeper, and patiently watching. Elders gathered beneath familiar trees, their silence heavier than words, their eyes reflecting recognition rather than surprise. Nothing that had happened shocked them. It aligned. In African folktales, elders rarely react because they remember. They understand that events do not move randomly. They move according to patterns set long before any one person arrived. What unfolded was not coincidence, it was correction. And correction, when guided by ancestral wisdom, does not rush. The village began to reinterpret its own past, replaying moments now charged with meaning. Warnings once dismissed resurfaced as proof. Silences once mocked gained weight. Traditions previously bent returned to center, reclaiming authority not through force, but through relevance. People realized the cost of ignoring what was handed down as protection, mistaking modern confidence for immunity. The ancestors' lesson was simple and unforgiving. Balance may bend, but it does not break. It waits. And waiting does not weaken it, it strengthens it. She listened as stories were retold with altered endings, subtle admissions woven into familiar narratives. No one named guilt directly. They didn't have to. Understanding moved through the village like a shared breath, slow and steady. What once looked like patience now revealed itself as alignment, with tradition, with restraint, with moral law older than memory. The lesson wasn't about punishment. It was about order. About knowing when to act and when to wait. About respecting silence, not as emptiness, but as preparation. Afternoons took on a reflective stillness, work slowing as thought deepened. Elders spoke less but were heard more. Younger ones asked questions they hadn't before, sensing that wisdom doesn't always announce itself loudly. The ancestors' presence was felt not through fear, but through coherence, the way events finally made sense when viewed together. Every delay, every ignored warning, every quiet endurance fit into a pattern that could no longer be denied. The village wasn't just corrected, it was instructed. She felt the lessons settle within herself as well, not as triumph, but as grounding. Her endurance had not been accidental. It had been guided by stories heard as a child, by proverbs remembered at the edge of despair, by instincts shaped by generations who understood timing better than emotion. She wasn't above the lesson. She was part of it, a thread woven into something larger than personal victory. As days passed, behavior shifted permanently. Mockery softened into caution. Certainty gave way to humility. The memory of reversal became a quiet reference point, shaping decisions without needing repetition. The ancestors' lesson had taken root, not as fear of punishment, but as respect for balance. In folktales, this is how order returns. Not through force, but through understanding that survives long after the story ends. Night fell once more, calm and contemplative, carrying the weight of recognition rather than tension. The village rested differently now, aware that unseen laws had been watching all along. And as she lay listening to the familiar sounds of life settling into place, one final truth lingered, steady and complete. When ancestors teach through time instead of thunder, their lesson lasts forever. Silence returned to the village, but it was no longer empty. It carried memory now, weight layered into the air like dust after rain. People moved with more care, as if the ground itself had learned how to listen. The story had ended, yet its echo remained, settling into daily life without announcement. She felt it in the way doors opened a second longer, in the way eyes softened instead of judged. Nothing demanded attention anymore, and that, somehow, made everything clearer. Silence had finished its work. The quiet ones were seen differently now. Not pitted, not dismissed, observed. The village had learned, slowly, painfully, that stillness does not mean surrender. It means timing. It means control. It means knowing when noise would weaken the outcome instead of strengthening it. The laughter that once ruled had vanished, replaced by caution that carried respect in its wake. People remembered the drum that never sounded until the moment it reshaped everything. She walked through familiar paths without announcing herself, unchanged on the surface, yet irrevocably transformed. There was no hunger for recognition, no need to retell what happened. Sweet revenge does not crave witnesses, it leaves understanding behind. Her calm no longer unsettled anyone. It instructed them. It reminded them that dignity, once restored, does not shout. It stands. Stories would be told long after this moment, reshaped for children and whispered among elders. Names would fade. Details would shift. But the lesson would survive intact. Do not rush judgment. Do not mock patience. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Because the quiet ones are often listening for the right moment, not to strike, but to correct. African folktales have always known this truth. That karma does not sprint, it walks. That justice does not argue, it arrives. That time is not neutral. It chooses sides based on endurance. This was never a story about revenge alone. It was a story about restraint, alignment, and the cost of arrogance when it underestimates quiet strength. As life continued, the village carried the lesson forward without ceremony. It lived in pauses before speech, in restraint before action, in humility before judgment. The silent drum had spoken once, clearly enough to last generations. It did not need to speak again. And so the story closes where it began, in stillness, not noise. With a truth that lingers longer than any punishment or praise. Do not mock the silent drum, because when it finally sounds, it will not ask who is ready. It will simply change everything forever, If you are the one that was humiliated in this video, and God being so kind later saved you from the hands of your enemies, what will be your reaction towards your oppressors? Comment and subscribe on this video. Let us know your mind.